technical assistance here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, good evening, and thank you so much for coming. And I'm really delighted to be the inaugural presidential candidate speaker in this important series. You know, I want to start by telling you what I think this election is about. And then I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what I think is at stake. I think our nation really is at a pivotal point. I think it's at a pivotal point for many reasons. But I think the majority of American people feel a sense of disquiet. I've traveled all across the country over the last several years and have spoken to all kinds of people about all kinds of issues. And what I keep hearing, regardless of party, regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of religious affiliation, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of circumstances, is a sense that things aren't working anymore. And perhaps it was best summarized for me by a gentleman that I was speaking to at a Rotary Club. And he said to me, after I had finished speaking and I was taking questions, he said to me, you know, Carly, we don't think of ourselves as a nation of limitless possibility anymore. I believe when we lose our sense of limitless possibility as a nation, we are losing the core of who we are. So I think this election is about whether we will have the kind of leadership necessary to restore real possibilities to every American, regardless of their circumstances. And I think most assuredly this election is about leadership. Leadership here in this nation to solve festering problems, and leadership around the world, because the world is a far more dangerous and tragic place when America is not leading. When I was a little girl, about 8 years old, one morning, my mother looked at me the way mothers can look at their children, and she said, what you are is God's gift to you, what you make of yourself is your gift to God. I didn't feel particularly gifted as a young girl or a young woman. But her words were a promise that I had God-given gifts, and they were a challenge as well, that I needed to find them and use them. As I have gone on in my life, I have learned over and over and over again that truly everyone is gifted by God, that everyone has potential, usually far more than they realize. I would graduate with a degree in medieval history and philosophy. All dressed up, nowhere to go. My dad wanted me to go to law school. I did. I hated it. I quit. And so I went back to work doing full-time what I had done part-time to put myself through school. I was a secretary. When I was in college, I was a temp girl, temporary office personnel. So I went to work full-time, typing and filing for a little 9-person real estate firm. I had no idea what my future was going to look like. But way back then, I learned my first lesson in leadership, although I did not know it at the time. Because 2 men came up to my desk, maybe about 6 months into the job, and they said to me, you know, we've been watching you and we think you could do more than type and time. Do you want to know what we do? And that was my introduction to business. Why do I say that was a lesson in leadership? Because what those 2 men did was see possibilities in me. And because they saw possibilities in me, I saw possibilities in myself. In other words, they helped unlock my potential. I am keenly aware, having lived and worked and traveled all over the world, that it is only in this nation that a young woman can start out typing and filing and answering the phones in a 9-person real estate firm, go on eventually to lead the largest technology company in the world, and run for the presidency of the United States. That's only possible here. And it's possible here because, honestly, our founders knew what my mother taught me and what I have learned throughout my life, that everybody has God-given gifts, that everybody has potential. And our founders built a nation on this extraordinary idea. It was extraordinary at the time, and it's extraordinary still. The idea was that here you have a right to fulfill your potential. And they said that right, they described it as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That right, they said, this was the radical part, came from God and could not be taken away by man or government. And so more things have been more possible for more people from more places here than anywhere else on the face of the earth. I said I thought our nation was at a pivotal point, and I do believe that. Because I think we have come to a place in our nation where the potential of this nation, where the possibilities of too many people living in this nation are being crushed by the weight, the power, the cost, the complexity, the ineptitude, and yes, the corruption of the federal government and the professional political class. 75% of the American people now believe the federal government is corrupt. 75%. 82% of the American people believe we have a professional political class that is more concerned about the preservation of its own power, privilege, and position than on getting the people's work done. I agree with them. And if you doubt that number, if you feel like maybe you don't fall into that category, consider this. Whatever issue you care about, whatever cause, maybe your issue has been growing debts and deficits. Maybe your cause has been, why do we keep tangling people's lives up in webs of dependence instead of encouraging them to move forward and find and use their God-given gifts? Maybe your cause is education reform. Maybe your issue is that we're crushing the real engine of economic growth in this nation, which is small business, family-owned businesses and farms. We're now destroying more of those than we're creating for the first time in U.S. history. Maybe that's your issue. Maybe your issue is a 73,000-page tax code. Whatever your issue, whatever your cause, whatever festering problem you hope would be resolved, the political class has failed you. How long have we been talking about tax reform? Decades. And yet somehow the tax code is 73,000 pages long. How long have we been talking about securing the border? 25 years. How long has it been insecure? 25 years. How long has the Veterans Administration been a stain on our nation's honor? At least 2 decades. How long has the regulatory burden been growing and growing and growing? At least 50 years. For how long have we said that crony capitalism is alive and well? It is, ladies and gentlemen, because guess what? Only the big, the powerful, the wealthy, and the well-connected can deal with big, powerful government. When I was the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, we took it from a $44 billion company to an almost $90 billion company. In the midst of the worst technology recession in 25 years, we grew the top line growth rate by 4 times. We quadrupled its cash flow. We tripled its innovation rate to more than 11 patents a day. We went from lagging behind to leading in every product category, in every market segment. And so I could deal with big government. Because if I didn't like the tax code or I didn't like the regulatory thicket, I could hire lawyers and accountants and lobbyists. But the little 9-person real estate firm I started out in, they can't handle it. The family-owned auto body shop that my husband Frank, 30 years, started out in as a tow truck driver, they can't handle it either. And so this burden, this incredible weight, is crushing the engine of economic growth. It's tangling people's lives up in webs of dependence. Meanwhile, the Department of Education gets bigger and bigger and bigger every single year under Democrats and Republicans alike, and yet our education system continues to flounder. We're not educating our children or retraining able-bodied Americans. And every law that gets passed creates more crony capitalism. Wall Street, remember Wall Street? Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Republicans and Democrats alike said the government should be in the home mortgage business. They created the financial crisis, and here we are. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac haven't been reformed. The 25 government agencies that were supposed to be minding the store haven't been reformed, but we've created another huge one. And 10 Wall Street banks too big to fail have become 5, even bigger, more powerful Wall Street banks, and thousands of community banks are going out of business. This crushing weight means our veterans aren't served because the bureaucracy is inept. Last time I was in Iowa, I met a man named Colin. That's just one example of what I'm talking about. Colin is a turkey farmer. And when avian flu hit Iowa, he knew exactly what to do. He knew how to euthanize his flock. He knew how to prevent the spread of the disease. And yet he was told by a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., you can't do that. You need to wait for us to tell you how. And so he had to wait for 6 weeks and feed his flock. And those feed trucks came in and out, spreading the disease and finally when the bureaucrats arrive, they do not a thing about his business. I remember him looking at me and saying, I've been in this business all my life. My family has been in this business for generations. I know what to do. And these bureaucrats showed up and said, no, we'll tell you what to do. By the end of this month, the EPA will control 95% of the water in this state. Now, politicians talk about all this stuff every election cycle. You're going to have presidential candidates come out here and talk to you about securing the border or fixing the VA. We've got loads of great ideas. Whatever your political persuasion, we've got loads of great ideas about how to fix these problems, and yet it doesn't really ever change. Every government agency has become bigger and more corrupt and less competent for 50 years. So why doesn't it change? I'm reminded of the difference between management and leadership. Managers are people who do the best they can within the status quo. They don't change the system. They accept the system. There are a lot of managers in business. There are a lot of managers in politics. I'm reminded of something that a heroine of mine, Margaret Thatcher, once said. She said, I am not content to manage the decline of a great nation. I believe we have been managing the decline of a great nation for far too long. And so I am prepared to lead the resurgence of a great nation. And all the way back to what I learned all those years ago about leadership, the highest calling of leadership is to unlock potential in others. It is not about power, position, or title. It is certainly not about going along to get along and preserving the status quo. One of the reasons I left HP, I got fired, After 6 years of doing all that, I got fired in the boardroom world. You know why? Because when you lead, when you challenge the status quo, you make enemies. It's part of it. I remember the day I was fired, my good friend Steve Jobs called me up and said, hey, I've been there twice. That's pretty good company to be in. Nowhere is leadership more necessary than in the world today. We need the kind of leadership in the White House that will challenge the status quo of Washington, D.C. We need a leader in the White House, a president in the White House who understands how the economy works. She must understand how bureaucracies work, so you can hold them accountable and cut them down to size. She must understand technology, because technology is a great tool, but it's also a weapon that's being used against us. But she must also understand the world and how it works and who's in it. I know more world leaders on the stage today than anyone else running. Only I didn't do photo ops like Hillary Clinton did. She may know a few more than I did, or some others. But I've done substantive meetings. And I want to tell you about one meeting in particular. 5 years ago, I had a private meeting with my good friend Bibi Netanyahu. It was my husband Frank, Bibi Netanyahu, and me. And what Bibi Netanyahu wanted to talk about in that private meeting in his office was Iran and the danger it represented. And then I walked down the hall and I met with the head of Mossad, because I chaired the advisory board of the Central Intelligence Agency. I've advised 2 secretaries of defense, a secretary of Homeland Security, a secretary of state, the head of NSA. I've held the highest clearances available to a civilian. And the head of Mossad talked with me as well about what they knew and what Israel would have to do if the United States of America would not stand with her. At the height of the Intifada, Hewlett-Packard, under my leadership, bought a company in Israel. It is a huge success now. And so I value Israel as a nation, not just because it is the only functioning democracy in the Middle East, not just because it is a society that values the contributions of all men and women, Israeli and non-Israeli alike, but also because I have seen its innovative capacity. You may not know this, but I do. Israel has the highest patent per head rate of any nation in the world. It is an example of the potential of people when focused on building a great life. So, on my first day in the Oval Office, I will make 2 phone calls. The first will be to my good friend Bibi Netanyahu, to reassure him that we will stand with the state of Israel. The second phone call will be to the Supreme Leader of Iran. Realistically, he might not take my phone call. But he will get the message. And the message is this: New Deal. New Deal. Until you open every military facility and every nuclear facility to real, anytime, anywhere inspections, we, the United States of America, will make it as difficult as possible for you to move money around the global financial system. We can do that. We need no one's permission to do it. We need no one's collaboration to do it. All we need to do is keep the Iranians cut off from the SWIFT global payment system and say to any bank that does business with Iran, you will not do business in the United States of America. We must do that. And as important as those two phone calls are in and of themselves, and they are a clear signal to every ally we have and every adversary we have that the United States of America is back in the leadership business. I believe at this pivotal time, we need a leader who understands that our highest calling is to unlock the potential of this nation, who understands that her highest calling is to challenge the status quo of a political class in Washington, D.C. that is failing us all. And I believe as well, the Commander-in-Chief must understand that a weary world is eager for us to accept once again the mantle of leadership that only the United States of America can wear. I will finish with that and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you so much.
The most famous case or instance of this discussion was from presidential scholar Richard Neustadt. He said, he recounted an episode with Harry Truman in 1952. And Truman was contemplating the possibility that Dwight Eisenhower would be elected to succeed him. And he predicted that the eminent general would have problems adjusting. Quote, he'll sit here, Truman would remark, tapping his desk for emphasis, and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Poor Ike won't be a bit like the Army, he'll find it very frustrating, unquote. The reason for this is that as president, you would have to work with a great many people, beginning with members of Congress, who are politically independent of you. They don't owe you their jobs. As president, you could not say, even in certain areas of bureaucracy, as one of your fellow candidates likes to say, you're fired. You could not say that. Think of Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, deciding not to back the Iran Pact. He's a Democrat. President Obama's a Democrat. But President Obama has to live with that. So he can't fire him. So for this reason, scholars say presidential power is not the power to command, it's the power to persuade. As Truman said, I sit here all day trying to persuade people to do the things they ought to have sense enough to do without my persuading them. That's all the powers of the president amount to. So my question then is this. Given your strong criticism of what you called our professional political class, in what way does your background as a corporate CEO enable you effectively to engage and persuade such independent political actors as members of Congress to support you in your program?
Well, it's obviously the question. So, to answer that question, let me begin in a slightly different place. Over the course of my career, people have asked me, how did you go from becoming a secretary to becoming a CEO? And the answer is I didn't have a plan to do that. But I ran to problems. And every time I ran to a problem, I found people who knew how to solve the problem. They'd just never been asked. And so what I did was unlock their potential to solve the problem. Now, why do I start there? Because the leverage that the American people have to put pressure on Congress is huge. And I would use technology to harness that power. Let me give you a very simple example of what I mean. You're right, three co-equal branches of government. Congress will not necessarily be persuaded by me. They must be persuaded by their constituents. Do you remember when the scandal at the VA broke in Arizona? Wait times. The American people were outraged when they learned this. They were so outraged that they flooded the offices of their congressmen and women and senators. And within 3 short weeks, Congress passed a bipartisan bill in the House and the Senate that established an amazing precedent that the top 400 senior executives of the VA could be fired if they didn't do their job. And President Obama signed it without a peep. Now, meanwhile, the political class has moved on. We just learned 2 weeks ago that over 250,000 veterans have died waiting for care, and you didn't hear a peep out of anybody in Washington. Nevertheless, the precedent has been set. So, there are some things we have to do to cut this bureaucracy down to size and hold it accountable. Let's start with there must be consequences for non-performance. Today, we know from Inspector General reports that you can watch pornography, literally, in any agency in government all day long and earn the same pay, pension, and benefits as somebody trying to do a good job. That's unacceptable. So remember this. Harness the power of the citizens who know the right answer. I will go into the Oval Office every week, maybe in a weekly radio address, and I will say to my fellow citizens, please take out your smartphones. I'd like to ask you a question. Do you believe it's important that we be able to fire senior executives in the federal government who do not do their jobs or who watch pornography all day long? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no. Ladies and gentlemen, this technology exists. We are living in a century when technology is the most powerful tool we have ever had for the democratization and to re-engage citizenry in the process of their government. I am willing to bet that the citizens of this nation, with your common sense, know that you have to have consequences if you want a competent organization. I am willing to bet that the citizens of this nation know that it's probably pretty important now that we actually know where your money is being spent. That would be called zero-based budgeting. Many states have it. That it's actually important that we know where your money is being spent so we can spend more of it in the right places. For example, ensuring we have the strongest military on the face of the planet. And we stop spending it in places where it doesn't matter. So I'm going to ask a series of questions to the American people. And that vote will put pressure on Congress. It's not that Congress people or senators are bad people. It's just they got caught up in their own status quo. And they stop remembering who they're there to serve. So that is what I will do. I'm willing to bet the citizenry, the focused power of the citizenry of this nation is sufficient persuasion.
Let me just have a quick follow-up. Who is the political class? I mean, if I gave somebody in public life's name, would we be able to say, oh yeah, that person counts as political class, or that person doesn't?
What I mean by professional political class, I'm not trying to be disrespectful of anyone. We have many people who are dedicated to public service and who are hardworking. But if you have spent your entire life doing one thing, running and winning, raising some money, running and winning, if you have spent your entire life in that system, your experience may be very deep, but it is very narrow. And it is true that the status quo has great power because anyone who benefited from the status quo wants to preserve it. So if you've been running and winning and running and winning and running and winning, I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you're not going to challenge that status quo. I believe at this pivotal time, we need a different experience set. I think, honestly, we need a leader who understands how the economy works, who actually understands how the world works, and who's in it, who understands bureaucracies, how to hold them accountable, how to cut them down to size, who understands technology, and who understands that leadership's job, that leadership is not about them, that leadership is about the people they are intended to serve.
Here's a question which several people have asked. Basically, what is your plan to deal with ISIS?
Well, the more we learn about ISIS, the more evil it becomes. It's not simply that this organization slaughters Muslims for being the wrong kind of Muslims. It's not simply that this organization is dedicated, among other enemies, to the destruction of Israel. It's not simply that this organization beheads, crucifies Christians. We now know that they are systematizing a culture of rape and sexual slavery. We know they are using mustard gas and Lord knows what other chemical weapons they're trying to get a hold of on their enemies. ISIS must be defeated. President Obama, unfortunately, is always presenting the American people with a false choice. He's doing it with this Iranian deal as well, by the way. President Obama's false choice is always this: if you don't agree with what I'm doing or not doing, the only option is to rush off to war. What he's saying about the Iranian deal, if you don't like the Iranian deal, he had the nerve to say that anyone who disagrees with him on the Iranian deal is the equivalent of the hardliners in Iran chanting death to America? Really? He also has said that the only option is rushing off to war, tens of thousands of boots on the ground. He said the same thing about ISIS. It is a false choice. So let me tell you what I would do. I know our Arab allies quite well. And so I know that King Abdullah of Jordan has been fighting ISIS as we speak for a year and a half. He came to this country a year and a half ago and he asked us for bombs and materiel. We have not provided them. And so he has gone to the Chinese. I will provide them. The Egyptians have asked us to share intelligence. We are not. I will. And I understand that Egypt is not always our best ally. I understand that Egypt and Israel have many issues, but I also know that the president of Egypt, for all his faults, when 21 Coptic Christians were beheaded on Egyptian beaches and he began bombing, he also went into the heart of Cairo. He addressed the 5 top imams, and he said, a pious Muslim himself, there is a cancer in the heart of Islam and you must root it out. In other words, he had the courage to speak the truth. The Saudis, the Kurds. How long have the Kurds been asking us to arm them? 3 years, and we still aren't doing so. So what I would do is hold a Camp David summit immediately. And I would summon our Arab allies, and I would ask them, what do you need from us to defeat this evil? Because they know it is their fight. But they need to see leadership and strength and resolve and support from the United States of America.
Suppose Bibi or other Israeli friends said to you, yes, we want you to stand by us, but if you provide those sorts of arms to America's Arab allies, they could be turned against Israel. What would you say there?
Well, it's obviously a very delicate balance. And clearly, there would have to be a set of inspections, agreements, so that that did not happen. On the other hand, I think Israel would also say, I'm quite certain that Bibi Netanyahu would say, that in this regard, Israel and the Arab allies that I just mentioned are on the same side of this. Israel clearly understands that ISIS must be defeated. It's not that we have no role in this. Of course we do. We probably need a far more effective set of bombing runs. We certainly will need more special ops forces. We certainly will need to be training forces more effectively than we have been. But I think there is no question that Bibi Netanyahu understands that ISIS has to be defeated, and it is far better that they are defeated by regimes who have a stake in their success.
A version of the same question, but flipped. What measures would you endorse to safeguard the U.S. from Muslim extremist elements with the enemy?
So there are a couple things that we know, and this is a great example, I think, of, frankly, the ineptitude of the federal government. And again, it's not because people are trying to do a bad job. It's that if you have a vast, bloated bureaucracy that just gets more money every year regardless of performance, and where somebody trying to do a really good job is treated just the same as somebody doing a really lousy job, what happens is, over time, that bureaucracy becomes, with all this money, not more competent, less competent. It happens with every bureaucracy. So, why do I start with that? As chairman of the advisory board of the CIA, I've been in the Defense Department in a number of advisory roles. I will tell you that each one of these attacks that we have seen, whether it's the Boston Marathon bombing, whether it's way back to the Fort Hood shooting, every single one of these instances, we knew there were warning signs. We knew that these individuals were a problem. And somehow the dots never got connected. That's about people not having the appropriate focus to make sure that every individual that pops up as a danger or a potential danger is monitored. And yes, I do mean monitored. If we think someone's an issue, I mean, think about it. The Boston Marathon bombers, we knew they had traveled to Chechnya. We got a very specific warning about those two brothers from Russian intelligence. That doesn't happen every day, ladies and gentlemen, and somehow we just ignored it. So, we have to take care of every single one of those warning signals and have the courage to go in and truly monitor these people. We also need to, I believe, review our refugee programs, our immigration programs, because our legal immigration system has been so broken for so long that the truth is we are letting people into this nation from parts of the world where there is a lot of conflict and we don't really know who they are. And finally, there is a very specific set of collaboration that is going to be necessary between the private sector and the public sector in order to be able to repel, detect first, and then repel cyber attacks. That can happen with the passage of a piece of legislation. The legislation just sits there. It ought to be passed. That would prevent some of the things like the China cyber attack. And eventually, we, yes, have to be pushing back in the battle of ideas. But first, we have to know who these people are. We have to monitor their activities. And we got to pick them up before they become a problem, not after the fact.
Beyond these issues involved with the Middle East, one person asks, what would be your priorities in foreign policy beyond the Middle East?
So I mentioned that it's important not only to make those 2 phone calls, but it is also an important signal that we're back in the leadership business. And we have, in addition to ISIS, which is a near and present danger, in addition to the Iranian regime, President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have been rewarding bad behavior for a very long time. And when you reward bad behavior, you get more of it. So when we open an embassy in Cuba without any change in Cubans' behavior, we're rewarding bad behavior. When Bashar al-Assad behaves in the way he is, slaughtering his people, crossing red lines and nothing happens, we get more bad behavior. Honestly speaking, when after the Benghazi attack, when Secretary of State Clinton and President Obama knew this was a purposeful terrorist attack, and yet the next day went out and apologized for a video, bad guys all around the world got the message. Nothing's going to happen. It would have been a very different message if Secretary of State Clinton the next day from the State Department had said very different words. If she had said, for example, this is a purposeful terrorist attack and there will be retribution, would have been a different message. So we have 2 rising adversaries we need to confront. Russia, Vladimir Putin. I've met him. I had one meeting with him. And I would not talk to him and I would not call him because we spent way too much time talking to him. But I would immediately begin rebuilding the 6th Fleet. I would immediately begin rebuilding the missile defense program in Poland. I would conduct regular, aggressive military exercises in the Baltic states, and I'd put a few more troops into Germany, and Vladimir Putin will get the message. He will continue to seize power and territory until he faces strength and resolve on the other side. China is our rising adversary as well. China is now threatening to control a trade route in the South China Sea that controls $5 trillion worth of trade every single year. And this issue, too, was made worse by the Obama administration, because the truth is the Obama administration negotiated a settlement over these disputed territories on which China is now building military bases. An agreement was negotiated about those disputed territories between the Philippines and China. The United States was the intermediary. China began to violate that agreement almost immediately, and we did nothing. So China kept going. And confronting China is going to mean that we need to equip our allies in that region, the Australians in particular, the Japanese, as well as the Philippines, with the equipment, the support, the technology they need to be more assertive in their patrols of those South China Seas. It means we have to use more effectively our economic leverage, and we have a lot with China, And most of all, it means that we must say clearly, with flyovers on a regular basis as necessary, that they cannot control that trade route. Russia and China must be confronted. ISIS must be defeated. The world needs to be very clear about where we stand between Israel and Iran, and we must stop rewarding bad behavior. Because the more we do that, the more we're going to get.
Shift to a non-military, at least in the immediate context of China. One question writes, John Huntsman, ambassador to China, stated that China's unfair trade practices cost the U.S. 2 million jobs. China's cyber attacks the U.S. is by far the world's largest polluter and manipulates its currency. What would you advocate we do about that?
And all those things are true. All of those things are true. So China has violated the agreements that they signed when they entered the World Trade Organization. In specific, they have violated those agreements around intellectual property protection. The China have been doing business in China for decades. The Chinese have a strategy to steal our intellectual property, and they are doing a really good job of it. By the way, they have also had a strategy for at least 12 years to hack into our most sensitive government databases and systems. So the fact that we could not repel that attack is ineptitude. We knew it. And by the way, if you think that is too strong a word, if you go back and look at the record, what you will find is that there were many Inspector General reports along the way telling the Office of Personnel Management, your systems are vulnerable. Some of the most basic protections were not in place. So, I mentioned that we have economic leverage. We do. The Chinese government has made a deal with their people. And the deal is this. You will tolerate repression, totalitarianism, censorship, poor safety standards, unbelievable pollution. You will tolerate all of that in return for economic growth that's fast enough to lift millions out of poverty. So when their economy falters, they are vulnerable. And right now their economy is beginning to falter. It is why they have devalued their currency. We have huge leverage. Why? Because we are their single largest market. We have great leverage. Why? Because virtually every piece of technology they have used to grow their economy has come from this nation. So I would begin by saying to the Chinese, New Deal. New Deal. You will have to play in our market by the same rules you force us to play by in your market. It would create a huge shift in the conversation and in the power flow. And that's what we need to do to get their attention. So we need to push back against them militarily so they do not continue this adventurism in the South China Sea. We need to use the economic leverage we have, and we need to have very plain talk about the fact that their cyber attacks are considered an act of aggression. We know how to do that to them, by the way, and we should, but we need to use our economic leverage.
Two questions on education. One is, the person writes, 70% of American high school graduates are not college ready. And in international, is it PISA tests? The U.S. is 24th in reading and 36th in math. What would you do about that? And then the follow-up question is, I guess, for those who get to college, the cost and the debt.
So, the Department of Education has been getting bigger and bigger for 30 years. It gets more money every year, and yet the quality of education continues to deteriorate. What should we conclude from this? The money spent in Washington, D.C. by the Department of Education doesn't have a lot to do with the quality of education. I spent 12 years in the state of California. The state of California spends more money per pupil than 49 out of 50 states, and the results are 49th out of 50th. So when politicians keep talking about investing in education and spending more money, it's not about spending more money, it's about spending the money in the right places. What is it that is most important to a child's education? We all know the answer to this, by the way. You know the answer to this. A great teacher in the front of the classroom and an involved parent or family member. That's what impacts a child's education. So we ought to be doing everything possible to have a great teacher in the front and an involved parent. What does that mean to me? What that means to me is we have to give every single parent, regardless of their circumstances, a real choice as to how they are going to educate their child. Vouchers, charters, parochial schools, we need to give parents, regardless of their circumstances, a choice. And we need to have high-quality teachers in front of the classroom. The teachers' unions and the Democratic Party are on the wrong side of this issue. And I will give you 3 quick examples of what I mean. In the county of Los Angeles, a relatively poor set of communities, African American and Hispanic parents mostly, ended up suing their school district because they could not get the teachers' unions to accept any responsibility for the failing performance. The teachers' unions appealed the decision. Ultimately, the court handed the decision to the parents, and they had a choice. Or I'll give you another example. Mayor de Blasio in New York City, as a platform of his election campaign, said he was going to do away with vouchers and charters and all manner of school choice. And guess who it was who marched across the bridges in protest? It was not white moms from the Upper East Side. It was Hispanic and African American parents who marched across the bridge knowing that if he took away their choices, he was taking away their children's chances. And finally, I will say, the head of the Chicago Public Teachers Union, when Chicago public teachers were protesting against Mayor Rahm Emanuel, the issue was accountability in the classroom. She took to the microphones and she said this, and I am quoting, "We cannot be held accountable for the performance of students in our classroom because too many of them are poor and come from broken families." So what was she saying? If you're poor, if you come from a broken family, you can't learn, we can't teach you. I don't believe that. Everybody has God-given gifts. So, less needs to come out of Washington, D.C. Common Core is a terrible idea because it is getting captured by, however it started as a set of standards. You know what it's turned into? A program that is being written by the testing companies and the textbook companies, both of whom have something at stake in how the industry rolls out, and it has become a bureaucratic program to teach teachers how to teach and students how to learn. We need to put as much responsibility back in the hands of communities and parents and give those parents as many choices as possible.
And student debt.
Student debt. So I'm going to say something maybe that some of you will find provocative. This is how socialism starts, ladies and gentlemen. Government creates a problem, and then government says it knows how to solve the problem. So, the cost of a college education has been increasing year after year in no small measure because the federal government has gotten involved in it. It's gotten involved in it through a set of complicated accreditation processes. It's gotten involved in it under this president because there is a program to try and eliminate choice in higher education. There's been a pretty concerted effort to put pressure on for-profit universities. And the student loan program, so the federal government is responsible, not solely, having served on two university boards, not solely. Universities are bureaucracies too, but the federal government has a lot to do with how expensive college educations have become. And then the federal government went one step further. The government basically nationalized the federal loan business. So instead of having a competitive student loan industry, the federal government sort of took all that over, and it's the federal government that decides on the interest rates that students will pay, and the federal government has decided the interest rate is, I don't know, somewhere between 4.5% and 6.5%, when the government is paying maybe a quarter of that interest on its own debt. What does that strike you? That strikes me as a racket. The federal government ought not to be engaged as much as it is in the higher education business. So once again, we need to give parents and students many choices, including in who's going to give them their loan. And I reject, by the way, the notion that every single student ought to go to a four-year college. My husband went to a tech school. There are a lot of people who can build a very good life for themselves is what they want to do, is learn a trade and go to tech school. Those are all the things I think we need to do.
I often say to my students, get good jobs, you're my Social Security.
Well,
The question wants to know, what would you do, given the fiscal lines that are
you know, by the the way, just on that last point, having started as a secretary, my advice to young people always is this: get a job. Don't wait for the perfect job. Just get a job. Because whatever job you get, you're going to learn something. You're going to learn something about yourself. You're going to learn about the world around you. You're going to learn skills that help you go on and get the next and better job. Just start working. What should we do about Social Security? You know, this is a topic that we talk about each and every presidential election. The truth is, there are binders full of great ideas on how to reform all kinds of entitlement programs. There are binders full of great ideas on how to take a 73,000-page tax code and make it maybe 3, so that everybody can understand it. And guess what? It never happens. Why does it never happen? Because the status quo doesn't know how to make it happen. I am not worried about lots of great ideas on how to reform Social Security. But I do believe this. Unless and until we can demonstrate to the American people that their government is competent, that their government is spending every single dime of taxpayer money wisely and well, why should the American people accept that the federal government says to them, you know, we're wasting a ton of money over here, billions and billions and billions of dollars, but now we're coming after your money. We can't get the cart before the horse here, folks. So I think the president, the bureaucracy, Congress have a lot of work to do before we ask the American people to give up more. And I'm quite confident there are many good ideas on how to reform it. Let me just give you one example of what I'm talking about. By the way, politicians will say all the time, well, but, you know, entitlements are 70% of the federal budget. I mean, you can't really do anything unless you reform entitlement. How many of you run your family budgets that way? How many of you say, well, only 30%, so therefore I can't do anything about that? When you're trying to cut spending, where do you start? You start with the basics first, right? So every year, literally every year, there is a report that comes out and that lands with a thud on Congress's desk that outlines tens upon tens of billions of dollars of fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, and guess what happens? Nothing. So before I'm willing to go talk to the American people about which of these many good ideas we should enact to reform Social Security, I'm going to make darn sure that I can look them in the eye and say, we have our house in order.
I was given the signal for one last question.
Okay.
Unfortunately, let's see, illegal immigration.
Well, not unfortunately. It's a huge problem. Yeah, it's a huge problem. How long has it been a huge problem? 25 years, folks, and every election we talk about it. The border has been insecure for 25 years. We're talking about it again, and yet it never seems to happen. San Francisco has been a sanctuary city since 1989. There are 300 others in this nation. Our legal immigration system has been broken for 25 years. We have 16 different visa programs. We don't have an employer verification system that works, therefore we can't hold employers accountable. It ought to be mandatory if we had a system that worked. We let the wrong people in, we send the wrong people home. Every day on our southern borders, we're handing out thousands of what are called border crossing cards. They permit someone to come in for a day, and we just never check if anybody went home. And oh, by the way, this is all what's going on, folks. This is ineptitude. And by the way, half the people who are here illegally came on a legal visa, overstayed, and nobody bothered to check. So, it's not rocket science to secure a border. Can we do it, please? Can we do it? And have you ever noticed that the federal government, anytime there's something important to do, the federal government asks for more money? You want to fix roads and bridges? We need more money. You want to secure the border? We need more money. How can it possibly be that government always needs more money when they spend more money every single year? It's called ineptitude. We don't know where we're spending money. So we have to secure the border. What does that take? Again, it's not rocket science. Money, yes. Manpower, yes. Technology, yes. Some portions, maybe a wall, but mostly what it takes apparently is political willpower and leadership. So we're going to do one of those press one for yes, two for no things on the border. We have to fix the legal immigration system. This is the most sophisticated country on the planet in terms of technology, and we can't build an employer verification system that will work? Of course we can. We gotta build it, and we gotta make it mandatory. We gotta clean up that legal immigration system. And then, when we have done those things, when we have demonstrated competence to the American people and solved a festering problem that the political class has let fester for decades, then we need to have a conversation about what to do with those who have come here illegally and stayed here illegally. My own view is they do not earn a pathway to citizenship. Perhaps a pathway to legal status someday, but I don't think you can say to people who have earned the privilege of citizenship the right way, and I know a lot of them, and a lot of them are Hispanic, by the way. They've studied our history, they've raised their hand, they've taken the oath. You can't say to them, there is no consequence for playing by the rules, and there is no consequence for breaking the rules.
Thank you. Take about 3 minutes for your concluding thoughts.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for asking all these fantastic questions, and allowing me to be here this evening. You know, I talked a lot about the need to unlock the potential of this nation. And that means we have to get our economy going and growing again by recognizing what the engine of economic growth really is. And it's small and family-owned businesses and farms and community-based businesses. Those small businesses have always created 2/3 of new jobs and employed half the people. So when we're now destroying more of them than we're creating, our economy will never get going again. I said we need to disentangle people's lives from webs of dependence. We encourage people not to move forward in their lives and find their God-given gifts, but to lay back. We need to hold government accountable and cut it down to size. We need to lead in the world again. And so I think often, as I run for president, what this nation must be, what it can be. And I think of two of the most powerful symbols of our nation's democracy, Lady Liberty and Lady Justice. Picture in your minds Lady Liberty. She stands tall and strong, as America must always be. She is clear-eyed and resolute. She doesn't shield her eyes from the realities of the world or the realities of our enemies. And yet she faces out into the world, which is the way America must always face, and she holds her torch high, because she knows she is a beacon of hope in a very troubled world. And Lady Justice. Lady Justice holds a sword by her side, because she's a fighter. She's a warrior for the values and the principles that have made this nation great. She holds a scale in the other hand. And with that scale, she says, all of us are equal in the eyes of God. And so all of us must be equal in the eyes of the law and government, powerful and powerless alike. And she wears a blindfold. And I think with that blindfold, she is saying to us that it must be true, that in this nation, in this century, it truly does not matter who you are, what you look like, how you start, what your circumstances. Here in this nation, it must be true that every American's life is filled with the possibilities that come from their God-given gifts, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so very much.